Few more people. Filter in. All right, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Adam Allouche. I'm the Director of Test Strategy here at ESM Prep, joined today by my esteemed colleague, Teren Teeples. Teren is a senior test prep mentor and manages all of our test prep mentors. So he's a great resource to understand these tests, but also how we prepare for them and how we view test prep.
Yeah, happy to be here today.
All right, our agenda today, we're going to start really with the impact of standardized testing on college admissions in 2026 and beyond. I will try not to give everybody the oral history of standardized testing since COVID and test optional. We'll try to keep it brief, but just really focus on where we are now for people who are starting to go through this, whether you have a junior that's about to apply or even younger kids. We'll update you on the new ACT Enhanced that came out last year, then compare it to the digital SAT. We'll tell you how we see the ACT versus the SAT in terms of which kids are taking what, how many kids nationally are taking each, and then also go over some various policies and myths, so to speak, about which tests might be better for which students. Then we'll shift our focus to really looking at each class in high school and even younger kids to figure out the best plans for them, what we recommend, and how things can deviate with a few variables. And then lastly, we will have time for questions at the end. So we'll answer any questions you have. All right, so let's do a quick overview of the different admissions policies that we're seeing in colleges. As all of you probably have heard, the vast majority of colleges were test required up until COVID, when almost all of them switched to either test optional or test blind. Right now, we are still mostly test optional. There are a few, really 5% of schools that are test required, but we'll go over those in a little bit more detail later. So what is test optional? Test optional simply means that students can submit a test as part of their application if they think it's advantageous to their application. You can see that over 1,700 schools still use that, even in 2026. Test required is what you're all probably familiar with from your time applying to college. It means simply you have to take the SAT or the ACT to apply. You can see that there are a few select schools that are still requiring, a lot of elite schools, a lot of southern state school systems are now requiring tests. Test blind is famous from the UC system and the CSU system. That simply means that you do not submit test scores as part of the application. They are not involved in how they evaluate students. And then test flexible is a pretty uncommon one. It is not very different than test required or test optional, depending on the type of test flexible, in which some schools allow you to submit AP exams, your A levels or IB if you go to an international school or a British school, instead of the ACT and the SAT. Now, it's very rare that students take advantage of test flexible. All right, so what have we seen recently? Well, for the first time in over 6 years, more students that submitted Common App applications submitted applications with scores than without. So you can kind of see in that graphic that we've had a pretty wide gap as early, as recent as 2023, 2024, and that is really narrowed in the last 2 years. And to now, we are seeing more applications with test scores than without. That is true for all demographic groups, all socioeconomic groups, and that's really due in large part to a few things. There has been a real return to tests required for the Ivy Plus schools. So we're seeing 2/3 of Ivy Plus schools now requiring tests for this past cycle. Princeton's going to join them for the sophomore class that's starting to think about test prep. And so when you have these elite schools and schools that are elite in their own categories, such as UT Austin requiring test scores, students are building this large college list. And at least if they're really looking for the top caliber schools, there's at least one school on their list that requires. And therefore, if you have to test for that one school, well, if that score is good enough, you're going to be submitting these scores to all of your schools. And so we're seeing that with Stanford joining test required this year, with UT now for 2 years in a row. Those are schools that get tens of thousands of applicants, over 100,000 we're expecting for UT this year. that has a real trickle down effect to other schools. And that's kind of why you're seeing this flip between fewer students not submitting and more students submitting. So why is this happening? Well, we are seeing an advantage for kids that are submitting test scores. Now, these are all data from 2021 and 2022 because schools, in a little bit of their naivete, gave us enough information in their press releases for their early decision classes, for their regular classes, where we could actually put together the admit rates. We would be able to, they would tell us, oh, so and this number of kids got in early overall out of this number of applicants. This is the number of applicants that submitted test scores early. And then these are the ones that were the number of students that were admitted early with test scores. And so we could do the math and figure out their admit rates, both for regular and early. And then schools figured out they gave us too much information, and we haven't seen any of this data since 2022 because it did not serve their best interest, because schools want more applications. They want applications lead to revenue. It makes them look more selective. Kids are applying without test scores. That means the ones that are or have higher test scores, their median test scores go up. So they're making more money, they're looking more selective, and they're looking like their incoming classes are having higher test scores. And so it's really a win, like on all fronts for schools. And we're seeing schools that are elite not require them because they don't really have to worry about their yield as much. They don't have to worry about the revenue that they generate to fund their admissions offices. And so that trickle down effect is really the reason why we're seeing that flip from majority not submitting to majority submitting. So where we are now, yes, if you're applying to elite schools, you would be hard pressed to find a college list where you don't have one school that doesn't require tests. And it is truly impossible to build that list for schools that don't show a previous bias towards students that submit competitive schools. So, or scores, excuse me. So Duke, Vanderbilt, Northwestern, the non-Ivies that are similar tiers, while they are test optional, a lot of them have shown historically a preference for testing. And so even if you have these schools where they are test optional, you are still better served in those schools to submit a test score. And students at the most competitive schools, the most competitive areas, the highest socioeconomic zip codes, those are the kids that are really expected to test because they are competing with students for admission in their demographic, in their schools, in schools like them in the area. And so those kids that have a lot of advantages in this process are all testing and testing well. So if you're the one kid at your school or that has the same GPA as everybody else, a great story, and you don't submit a test score, but somebody else submitted a near perfect score, we are seeing the kids that have near perfect scores be selected.
Yeah, jumping into the new test on the block, the enhanced ACT. For those of you who are aware, the test prep realm has been changing a lot in the past few years. So the SAT kind of set the standard in 2024 when they switched over, and then the ACT followed that trend and released their new enhanced format in September of 2025. Now, I like to talk about the major changes to the ACT in kind of three realms. First is timing. This graphic on the right-hand side shows a big timing shift in time per question, overall time of the test. And then the other major shift in timing is that science section that was a staple of the ACT has now gone optional, and very few schools are actually going to be requiring it, at least so far. Schools are changing their mind and they're shifting what they require year over year, and so that may change. The other big change is the scoring, and so instead of with the science section being optional, that composite score that we're looking at is going to be made up of the English, math, and reading sections now, with the science being a standalone or separate score. The last major change is in formatting. And so the enhanced ACT is still offering that paper format that we know and love, or that we took when we took this test back in the day. But they're also offering a new computer-based format. Now, I say new, but they have been offering a computer-based version of the test internationally for years, but they have revamped their overall formatting of the test with different number of questions, how they're presenting some questions, and then that time per question on both the computer-based and the paper formatting. Now, one advantage of the computer-based potentially is that there is Desmos available, which is something that the SAT set the standard for back when they made their change, and the ACT is offering on that computer-based format of the test, which I'll dive into Desmos a little bit more when we talk about the SAT. One Other kind of auxiliary change that was not going to impact every student is that the ACT used to have a fifth experimental section that they would give students at the end of their scored portion of their test. And instead of offering that experimental section to test new questions and kind of get insight into how students are going to perform on different questions, they're building some experimental questions into the test itself. And so there are some unscored questions that they're dealing with. Now, anything you wanted to add on the enhanced ACT, Adam, with those changes?
I can do my first interruption for story time with Adam here. So, just a peek behind the curtain for last year, for those of you that maybe have juniors right now, we were really skeptical of this new ACT Enhanced last summer because the rollout of it was very subpar, we'll say. The practice tests that we were getting were old tests that were retrofitted to the new format. And so because of that, we didn't really trust the scoring scales because we knew that they didn't have real data to back it up because they were old tests, right? They didn't go through the same equating standards that we have when they create new tests. And so we really leaned towards the SAT last summer because we just were wary. We wanted to see some real data for this new test because we thought, wait, okay, the main thing for the ACT that had students perform not all so well was that it's a fast test, right? A lot of students opted for the SAT because the ACT was just prohibitively fast and they couldn't get to all the questions. And so when we see the shorter test where there's fewer questions per most of the sections and then more time per question in each section, we were really worried about the steepness of the linear curve and say, okay, well, if you're giving them more time and there's fewer questions, so the pacing and the stamina is, and science is optional, so it's only a 2-hour test for many kids now, what something has to give, and we thought that would be the scale. But after seeing 4 tests now, we've seen a real test from October when they were released, what's called the My Answer Key. We get to see a copy of it. They haven't drastically increased the difficulty of the test, and the scaling is pretty good. And so we are now thinking it's a pretty viable test going forward and kind of back in that mode where students can truly choose the test that's best for them.
Just to kind of highlight on the ACT, I talked a lot about the formatting, the major timing changes, and all of that. The content itself hasn't changed very much. So there is a few content differences, but they're very, very small. And so students are seeing the same things that they were seeing on that old format of the ACT, just in the new updated version. But jumping into the SAT, I'm just going to highlight some of the major changes with the SAT being the more tenured test on the market now. One major difference between the SAT and the ACT is that the SAT is adaptive. And so every section has 2 modules, and based on a student performance on that first module, the second module will scale in difficulty to kind of give them an opportunity to show the level of skill that they have on those different sections. The other major change that the SAT ushered in that I touched on with the ACT computer-based is the inclusion of Desmos, which is a graphing calculator utility that students can use to circumvent some of the conceptual deficiencies they might have in math, but ultimately is another tool that they're going to need to learn and be able to utilize to be effective on these tests, and specifically the math portion of these tests. The other big difference that we've seen between the SAT and ACT, or that the SAT changed to, was their scoring system and being more cryptic with how they're scoring. So we know that from our testing that the questions are not weighted equally, and that missing easier questions or some of the grading questions can be more punitive overall on this test. And so they don't really give us much information on what a missed question leads to as far as scoring, and the score reports aren't giving much information there either. But overall, we are still able to garner some information from those score reports, and then we have our own internal testing that we utilize to help build students' foundations, build their confidence, and get them to where they need to be.
I will save my tirade for that for the slides. So before we get into really comparing the 2 tests and how to choose, just wanted to go over some of the most common questions I get from parents related to choosing tests and how the colleges weigh the test. So do they have a preference for one test? No. All colleges accept both and don't have a preference for one. So we can truly choose the test that best fits each student. What is super scoring? Super scoring is when you take your highest section score across all test dates and combine it to be your highest possible score. So you can take your highest SAT reading and writing score from your October test and your highest math score overall is in your December test, you can put those together to create a higher score than any individual test sitting that you had. There are a few schools that don't allow you to do that. I've highlighted some here, and there are some schools that don't allow you to do it on the ACT. Generally, more schools are not allowing students to do it for the ACT than the SAT, but most schools allow you to do it for both. So you can kind of see the list there. The ones that aren't on here that generally don't allow super scoring are other state schools. So university like Texas A&M, University of Kansas. You should always go to their websites before you apply and just double check that they haven't changed things. Admissions offices generally are slow to change the language on their site, so you could even call the admissions office to make sure that you have the most up-to-date testing information and requirements. Do colleges care how many times you take it? No, they really don't. This is the biggest myth that I get asked about. Only a few schools, and you can really see them, almost all of them there, require you to submit all of them. They don't really look at all of them. They still are going to look at the score that puts your student in the best light according to their requirements. You can see Georgetown there has a lot of bolded no's and yeses. They are our diva of the college admissions process. They have their own application portal. They have their own essays, and they just haven't changed their policies in decades. And so I've had students get into Georgetown with 6 tests, 7 tests, 8 tests submitted. And then a very common claim, this type of student does better on this test. That is largely false. There's a lot of different things you'll hear about, oh, the kids in our school generally do better on this test, or that are in this math class, or have this passion. Generally, it's untrue, and it's still really important for students to take diagnostics of both. The one thing I will say is that we've seen 2 traits on these new comparisons really matter, and one is your ability to move quickly. That hasn't changed. If you can't finish the ACT, it's going to really cap your upside and generally make the SAT a better fit. That happens less frequently now with the more relaxed pacing of the ACT Enhanced, but it still does happen. And then the one that has come up is the ability to really be a creative problem solver on the math section. We have talk to so many parents who come to me, and we're doing our test prep consultation, and the first thing they say is, my kid has a straight A's in math class. They're in pre-calc right now as a sophomore. How do they get a 510 on the PSAT math? And the honest truth is just that the way that math is taught in school these days, even at the best high schools, is really iterative. Kids are able to just regurgitate a process and memorize a process that they've learned in class on a test. It doesn't deviate too much. And they're able to get A's on tests and homework without really understanding concepts and being able to tinker and play with concepts in the way that the SAT that really makes you do. And so we've seen a lot of kids struggle with that, and to the point where we have kids switching to the ACT Enhanced now because they just were limited in their upside on the SAT math. And when you take into account, as we go to the next slide, the fact that the ACT only has 33% of the score to math and the SAT has 50%, that is a pretty big difference if you're struggling to have an upside on the math section. So Teren, boil this down for us. What are the other changes that we've seen, and what are the other things that we look for in helping students decide?
Yeah, so we've kind of talked about I've kind of hit on some of the aspects or differences between the tests, but in making a decision between what tests, which we'll dive a little bit more into later on, you kind of hit on math being a big one, abstract math concepts and math ability. I would even argue that almost all the students I've worked with have known a lot of the math content on the SAT, but struggle to utilize it to the level that they need to be successful. Beyond that, and making kind of a decision between these 2 different tests, mindset is huge on these tests overall, and a student's ability to, or perception of how they did on these tests, is something that we want to consider as we're making this decision. One other big difference between the SAT and ACT that holds strong is the longer reading passages on the ACT tend to be a little bit more daunting to some students, and a lot of students are liking the short, kind of single question reading passages. But we see that fluctuate student to student as well. But overall, these tests they're doing very similar things in reducing the amount of time that students are needing to spend on them, even though they are emphasizing different sections more than others at times. The other big aspects that we like to consider with students and students specifically aiming for those really high competitive scores is that oftentimes the ACT is going to be an easier path to a higher percentile score. The hardest parts of the SAT are harder than the hardest parts of the ACT. for most students, at least that we are seeing. And with the lack of transparent scoring on the SAT and us being able to see kind of question for question layout of what students are missing on official ACTs, we see an easier roadmap to students scoring into those higher caliber scores. I feel like we're seeing a higher trend of students who are hitting a wall on the SAT and then using the ACT as a potential refresh now that we have a lot more information going into future tests to be able to utilize and help them to understand the ACT's formatting better.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of an anecdote there. Say you have a kid that's scoring in the 1400s, low 1500s on practice tests. They know what that feels like. They take a test. They say, oh, it went as planned. And then you get their March SAT scores back. They get a 1420, which is a little low. They wanted a 1500. But if you look at their score report, what they give you is they give you 4 different categories in reading and writing, 4 different categories in math. We know the concepts that fall within each of those categories. So it's a little bit helpful, but they just give you like a bar graph with 7 bars. And so for kids that are getting 1420s, 1450s, and want something in the 1500s, a lot of them have full bars on all 8 sections across reading and writing and math. And so you're like, well, it felt great, just like my practice test. I don't remember having any real struggles. It looks like I didn't have any conceptual deficiencies. Like, how do you prepare from that? And so, the reality is they probably made some mistakes they didn't account for, or they were so stressed, maybe they forgot the moments that really did feel difficult. But you have no real way to move forward. And you could miss, 5, 6, 7 questions. And if they're the wrong questions, if you made a couple mistakes, you can already be docked down under 1500 overall. And so it's really hard to predictively, to really predict when a student can get that 1500 plus score on the SAT. We've seen a lot of students have to take it 4, 5, 6 times just to give themselves a chance to have the day where they minimize mistakes, or they get a little lucky with the hardest questions where it's a vocab word they know, or it's a math concept that they just reviewed that week. Whereas the ACT, if you take it now, if you take the April test, you can purchase a copy of the test. You get to see exactly how many you missed. You get to see exactly which questions you missed, and you get a full copy of the test. You can do that in June as well. You can do that in October. And then there's linear scoring. You can look at your score report on any test and say, I missed this number of questions and I got this score. And we love to go on Reddit or even crowdsource from our own company and say, oh, we can build the scale for these tests and predictably know, oh, if you're getting X number of wrong in practice, it's going to reliably be this score. And so for all of the reasons, and when the margins are so small, we have seen the ACT be a little bit easier to hit that 99 percentile. And we have had a lot of kids in 2026, especially, switch over from getting to the 1400s on the SAT, stalling out around there, and then hitting the 35, 36 on the ACT.
So picking between the tests, the age-old question in starting the test prep process, we always want to be making an informed decision when we're picking between a student taking the SAT or ACT. And part of that process is, of course, diagnostics, like getting scoring, getting to know what those scores are looking like. We do recommend taking an actual full-length SAT and ACT diagnostic to inform those decisions. And so we do advise against using the PSAT or PSAT for those data points. Even though a student is sitting and they look like the SAT or look like the ACT, oftentimes it's a school day, it's not by choice. They are not taking it seriously. And so using that as a valid data point to help make that testing decision can be a little bit dangerous in outlining what their full capacity could be if they were to take it more seriously. The other aspect of this that makes it a little bit more difficult is just because a student scores higher on one of those diagnostics does not mean that that might be the test for them, even though that is probably an indicator that they are doing better initially. It might be easier for them to carve out a path to a higher score on the ACT than the SAT, or even vice versa, depending on what types of questions they're missing, or what content they are stronger in. And so we really recommend that you consult your college counselor or a test prep expert in making this decision. And then you combine both your quantitative data that you're getting from taking diagnostics with qualitative, how the student felt about the tests, what the path looks like as far as question types that they can be capturing points on more quickly than question types that might be harder for them to capture points on later on in the test. Of course, there are a lot of other factors that go into this, which is again why we recommend that you consult an expert. But But ultimately, choosing this test, even though we would love it to be clear cut and easy, is something that has a lot going on. And so, anything else you want to add on this, Adam?
Yeah, I think test choice for many students doesn't matter. It really matters most for kids that are trying to hit 97th, 98th, 99th percentile. If you have a kid who's getting an 1,000 on their diagnostic SAT or a 21 and they want to get into the maybe try to get to 1,300 or a 27, prep and gathering the what we call the low-hanging fruit can get you there, right? And so for most kids, they're going to do pretty similarly. And it's really about projecting, okay, where do you need to be? What schools are you tentatively looking at combined with your GPA at the time? And where do we see the path of least resistance to get to your rough score goal? So it really makes them, the higher your diagnostic scores are and the higher your ambitions, the more important score or test choice becomes. And then the other factors really weigh heavily. I consider a lot of these tiebreakers for kids that are like, oh, my scores are about the same. The outlook is about the same. I didn't have a preference for one or the other. Test schedule and availability matters, right? We know students have tons of commitments, sports, extracurriculars, trips. So if you're not available for 2 of the 3 fall ACTs, then you probably should, and you really want to get done early, you should take the SAT. The SAT also has way more tests in the fall semester. They have a late August test, early September, early October, early November, early December, whereas the ACT has mid-September, late October, and mid-December. They're all on the next slide, don't worry. And so if you really want to get this done early and you think you go either way, the SAT is definitely an easier test to finish within the fall semester. Accommodations is big. The ACT generally is stricter about accommodations than the SAT because the timing component of it has been the thing that really restricts scores. And so they look for students to have longer term diagnosis, to have had a diagnosis for over a year in most cases, and have used accommodations in school for about a year, whereas the SAT is generally 4 to 6 months. And so if you're approved on one and not on the other, that kind of makes the decision for you. We talked about score tier. School day tests is generally tests that our students can take in school. Usually, if you're a junior, it's in the spring semester. If you're a rising senior, it's generally in the fall semester. And schools can just have a test in school, SAT or ACT. So if your school is preparing to give you a test the spring semester junior year, that's an SAT, and you really want to take a test at school because you're less anxious there, it's a more familiar environment, that can help sway your test choice. And then we already talked about pacing versus your mental pliability. All right, so we'll go over some basic plans for graduating classes here. I have all these dates written out, and I will, of course, share the deck with all of the participants. You'll be able to find it as a resource on our website. We'll start with our current juniors, so the ones that are really trying to finish testing or maybe have finished testing or are looking at tests in this fall semester of their senior year. That can really take a lot of different forms. For kids that are still in Algebra 2 as juniors, they might just be starting out their official testing right now because they needed to finish Algebra 2. So most of those kids are definitely going to test early into their senior year, where there are some students now that are trying to finish testing. They've done all the math. They've been prepping since the fall or even last summer, and they're just looking for those extra couple of points on the test to be done. Those kids hopefully can finish between now and June, or I guess July for the ACT. But if they don't, you have to be able to plan accordingly. So the first thing for those of you in the Bay Area, New York, LA, play it safe and register. If you think there's a chance your rising senior needs to take a test this fall, you should register them for tests from the August to October SATs, and maybe even the November and December, depending on if they're applying early or not. You just don't want to be caught out and have your student on August 22nd have to drive 2 hours away to take the test, because that when you're trying to be done and you're trying to get an extra 20 points on the SAT or that extra point, those little things can really matter. So just play it safe and register. You can always cancel your SAT registration for, I think, $68. You can get 34 back. You can move it to a later test date if you need to, and it's just worth the peace of mind. For students that have taken the SAT or ACT 2-3 times and they just are hitting that wall or stalling out, is a good time to reevaluate which test you should pursue over the summer and in the fall. That's especially true for that SAT wall, to possibly considering the ACT as we laid out. There are a lot of students that are hitting that wall and then are saying, wait, no, this test is a little longer, it's a little more reading, there's more questions, but I just like how straightforward it is. I'm not hitting those hard vocab questions, those impossible reading questions and math questions. So it's a chance to reevaluate, to maybe take an ACT diagnostic after meeting with a tutor to see if that's, if you learn the basic strategies, and then say, oh yeah, I see the upside here. Maybe I want to pivot. Like we said before, ask about school day tests. Just check in with your school to see if you're a rising senior, whether they're going to give an SAT, an ACT, both, which is rare, but does happen, just so you can add that to your calendar and make sure you're aware that that's a test you're going to take. And then most importantly, avoid score obsession and trust your process. When you are going into senior year, you're working on your college essay all summer. You're working on your applications for most of the summer. You're probably choosing your ED school over the summer. The realities of the score you need become really crystallized that summer. And so the pressure to get it for students really becomes more acute. And that's true for anybody. That's true, whether it's, if a parent is telling you, oh, I need this, or it's just the pressure that the kid's putting on themselves because they really want that school. And so that pressure can be really overwhelming. Kids feel this pressure on normal circumstances when they take these tests early in their junior year. There's always pressure and anxiety with standardized testing, but it gets worse the longer you get. So that's kind of why, to go to our next slide, we recommend that kids do prep before their junior year and test early into their junior year, because it's a little bit of a sweet spot where most have finished Algebra 2, they are prepared conceptually, they're mature enough to take on this responsibility over the summer. It's the most time that they're going to have from now until graduation, really, or at least until they apply to college, and they can finish in the fall so they can make sure that their junior year grades aren't affected as much. And there's a sweet spot between, hey, I don't really know exactly where I want to go to college yet, but I know I need to do as well as I can on this test to keep my options open. And so that's a nice sweet spot where the anxiety doesn't hit too much for most kids. So students that have finished Algebra 2 as sophomores, or finished pre-calc or above as sophomores, we recommend taking diagnostics now if you haven't already, organizing your accommodations with your school. So a lot of sophomores already have their College Board accommodations in place if they took an official PSAT, but it's worth, if your student has a learning difference, to check in with your school's learning office and say, hey, have you applied for College Board accommodations? Or can we go through the process of starting to apply for ACT accommodations? To do that, you need to register for an official test to start that, so they can walk you through that and put it on their radar. Ideally to get it done before school ends, because generally counselors and the learning office at schools are not super available when school's out for the summer. Determine your testing timeline based on your diagnostics and test choice, saying, okay, I'm going to target these 3 test dates in a row in the fall, but I'm also know that I might finish early or might need another 1 or 2. And then, like we said, register for SATs in early May when it becomes available. For summer, prep intensively. When you are available, make this a priority. We generally equate the workload to that of an AP class over the summer. Take at least 2 practice tests, if not more, depending on your timeline. If you're a high scorer that really wants to get this done in 1 or 2 tests, we definitely recommend more than 2 practice tests. If you are taking the ACT, the registration opens in early July, so you have a little bit more time to get ready for that, as opposed to early May when the SAT, without warning, the College Board tells us, hey, by the way, we opened this, good luck. We get no warning, whereas we do with the ACT. And then try to leave the summer fully prepared to test at the score that you want. So we really want to see a practice test score before the end of summer that hits the mark, so that when you're in school, you're maintaining your skills rather than having to really build a lot of extra skills in, which can take a lot more time, requires a lot more homework, and can get in the way of fall semester of junior year when you have way more homework, when the rigor of your classes goes up, and the importance of those grades is massive, right? Junior year GPA is the most important single variable in the admissions process. So by the time school hits, you're able to maintain your skills, you're honing small things, you're taking practice tests and practice sections to work on your decision making, and then trying to finish as early as possible so you can get this done. You can check a box. I joke that I made a career out of checking a box for a lot of students, especially those that are trying to hit the 99th percentile. Once you get there, it's just like, oh, cool, I did it. Now they're just going to evaluate me and everybody else on the other parts of our application that are more interesting. So just check that box, get done, and then move on to making sure your grades are great, that you can put more time into your extracurriculars. Teren, you want to handle for our sophomores that are finishing geometry?
For sophomores finishing geometry, absolutely. Consider taking Algebra 2 over the summer. Ultimately, we generally don't recommend that students are starting full force test prep until after they finished Algebra 2, because Algebra 2 is the math level that you or approaching when you hit the test prep realm. You can do a few things beforehand, specifically getting your accommodations in place, making sure that if you have in-school accommodations, you're using them, and then starting to have talks with your college counselor about how that's going to look for your test prep. And then setting a timeline in place. You can always still take these diagnostics if you'd like to, especially if you're going to take Algebra 2 over the summer and maybe do some test prep concurrently. And then we can get you going on some earlier content on like the English or reading or yeah, specifically English or reading sections or reading and writing section on the SAT. But putting a timeline and having a plan in place is probably the most impactful thing that you can be doing and making sure that you're getting your registrations in place and getting ready to go on the test prep realm. Because as soon as you're ready with that content on the math end, we're ready to dive in and get you going on test prep.
Yeah, and this is the timeline and situation that probably has the most variability depending on score level for the various sections. So regarding Algebra 2 over the summer, it's a really great thing to do not only for test prep, but it puts your juniors on track to take pre-calculus and then for them to take calculus or AB as a senior, which is the math check that a lot of schools look for. It is sometimes hard to get a school to approve your taking Algebra 2 over the summer. So it's definitely something you should talk to your school counseling office to see if you can get it accredited. To be honest, if the school is not going to let the kids skip Algebra 2, it's probably a little bit extra to take this for something that's not for credit that can't be added to the kid's GPA, or they're going to have to take Algebra 2 anyways as a junior. So at that point, we'd probably just extend the timeline and let the math catch up throughout the school year and consider taking a different summer course that maybe builds on a hobby or passion that they have to show an arc overall of their interests. Students that are really excelling in the verbal portion over the summer and they're getting way beyond where they thought they would get, they're in the 700s or low to mid 30s for the ACT, we would consider those students to take a test in the fall. And that could be as early as the August SAT if they're really progressing, or the September ACT, so that they can say, hey, I'm shooting for a super score. I'm not really looking at Ivies or many schools that are not going to allow me to super score either test, especially the ACT. And I can knock the English and reading of the ACT out in September, maybe October, take a break, and then resume prep in February so I can just focus on math for that April, maybe June ACT. And then that really just determines how you're going to do this over the spring semester. Generally, students have covered all of the Algebra 2 concepts they need by the March SAT or April ACT. For students that maybe want to take the February ACT, maybe they can just cover some of those one-off Algebra 2 concepts that get learned in the second semester of junior year Algebra 2 and just try to focus on the February ACT. Maybe they haven't taken the English and reading yet, and they want to take that as a way to try to knock it out before the April and June tests. And then younger students, I've had more and more families come to me and say, how can I get my middle schooler prepared for these tests? Some even third graders, fourth graders recently. The best thing that you can do is have them read. Like, can't stress that enough. Reading is important. It's happening less and less every year due to many circumstances I'm sure we're all aware of, and mainly social media. But kids are not reading long form things and are not learning how to synthesize long text anymore. And so getting kids interested in reading, whatever it is, it really doesn't matter what they're reading. You don't have to have your 9-year-old reading the New York Times every Sunday. That they can just read things that they like, that challenges their vocabulary, allows them to understand, oh, I know what this word means just because I know all the words around it and I know what they meant. Even if I've never seen that word before, all of those things are really, really useful. Also, it allows them to synthesize information, which really becomes important as kids enter high school. Even our sophomores that are going to junior year benefit from prep before junior year because they have so much more reading in AP US history or AP Lang or AP Lit, that being able to really get through text quickly and pull out the important parts helps them manage their workload. Find math challenges outside of the classroom. That can be logic, puzzles, just things that allow them to think about math flexibly, will keep their brains malleable enough so that they can still do well on the SAT in the event they choose that, because they're just not learning math iteratively only in school. Learning foundational grammar is great. Grammar is just not taught in high school anymore, as many of you I'm sure know. And so those are generally things that are easy points to gain and also just help with writing for kids, even in as young as middle school. And then most importantly, make it light and fun. Do not tell your eighth grader that they need to start SAT prep this summer. They are going to freak out. They're gonna, one, tell you they don't want to do it. And it just puts stakes on this way too early. They are probably probably even 3 years away from taking this. So just say we're going to build some schools. We're going to make some skills, excuse me. We're going to make sure you don't get rusty over the summer. We're going to teach you some good habits before you enter high school. And just don't call it SAT, ACT prep. We don't need to apply that pressure very, very early. This can get done in 3, 6, 9 months, no more than a year if we start the summer before junior year. Now, having said that, if you have a brainiac freshman who is already in calc and ace the PSAT 9 and you want to get them and they're just excited, they like tests, this is something for them to do, that's probably the only concession I would make. We have some kids that are entering sophomore year take these tests because they're just ready to do it. We don't want the math to be even farther in their rear view because they're going into BC Calc as a sophomore. But for the kids that don't really fit that mold, just gradually building these skills and make it fun. Find somebody that they can do this with, that they enjoy being around, that doesn't make them stressed out or anxious and is really additive in ways other than just test preparation. And I know the pressure is big. Like I know there are parents out there that do this and that tell you about it and brag about it, but just really resist it. Students generally become much more anxious the earlier they start prep if it's not framed correctly.
I just want to jump in, Adam. And I know that the read is bolded and that we hit on it hard, but please, please have your students read. I cannot tell you how much of a difference I've seen anecdotally with students who are avid readers versus students who don't want to pick up a book, especially on that vocab portion of the SAT. And then I also just wanted to hit on the goal of our mentors early on in the test prep process when a student is ready to get going is to still make it light and fun. That doesn't go away just because they're younger. That stays, it holds true. And we feel like that rapport building and that mentorship that we aim to bring to the process. And it's test prep. It's not always the most fun process. It's stressful too. It's college admissions. It's impacting their future. So us trying to make it fun is trying to make the whole process overall more enjoyable. And I just wanted to reiterate those 2 points.
Great test prep mentors make students hate this less. No one likes it. They just make them hate it less.
I think our goal is to be the highlight of their week, even though it's test prep.
Yes. And then even with math challenges, like video games, certain video games that are puzzle based, that are strategy, like that is I'm not saying Fortnite or something but like Minecraft, for example, like even just the puzzle solving is useful to keep kids' brains going. Now, of course, there's limits to that. We don't want them to be playing this all the time and we need to make time for other things, but there are things that can be useful even in games for them to keep their strategy, their problem solving brains working. All right, that's it for us. If anybody has any questions we didn't address, let us know. We'll stay around for a few minutes. Teren's also going to launch a poll that if you would like to hear from us and talk in greater detail, we're more than happy to reach out. But yeah, if you have any questions now, we're happy to answer it. If not, thank you for attending and watching, and we will talk to you soon.